Welcome to WITA's Friday Exchange. Each week, we bring you inside the room with former trade negotiators and policy insiders to unpack the latest in trade and tariff developments, what's been announced, what's at stake, and what might come next. Imagine our speakers are sitting at a local pub after a tough week at the office or at the negotiating table, downloading with their colleagues about the latest developments in international trade. That's what we aim to bring you with WITA's Friday Exchange. New episodes drop every Friday. Subscribe on YouTube, Apple Podcasts, or Spotify to be the first to know when they go live. Hello, and welcome to WITA's Exchange podcast. We're recording this week's episode on Friday, October 31st at 10 a.m. U.S. Eastern Time. So depending on when you download and listen, the trade issues we're discussing today may have changed. So today is Halloween, and we saw a lot of treats bestowed this week and not too many tricks, as the president just concluded a big trip to Asia, and the White House announced several new trade deals, including with the biggest trade partner of them all, China. Our discussants today will break down the Asia trip that we've all been waiting for and get us up to speed on where things are with some of the U.S. biggest trading partners. Welcome to the Exchange podcast to Wendy Cutler, Senior Vice President, the Asia Society Policy Institute, and the former Acting Deputy United States Trade Representative for Japan, Korea, and APEC Affairs. Dawn Shackleford, President at Looking Glass Trade LLC. Dawn is the former Executive Director for Trade Agreements and Negotiations at the U.S. Department of Commerce and a former Assistant USTR for Southeast Asia. Sara Schuman, Managing Director and International Trade Practice Leader at Beacon Global Strategies and a former Minister Counselor for Trade Affairs at the U.S. Embassy in Beijing during the first Trump and Biden administrations. And our discussion leader today, Joe Dimond, Chair of International Trade Policy and Global Life Sciences at Crowell Global Advisors, and the former Acting Assistant USTR for Asia and the Pacific, among other roles. Joe?
You can, and good morning, everybody. Good morning, Wendy, Sara, Dawn. We've had a lot of scares this year on international trade, so it's appropriate that we be talking about these issues on Halloween. Following Ken's note, maybe it wasn't so bad this week. There's a lot of news this week because the president and his entourage were in Asia all week, starting with Malaysia, and then going to Japan and Korea for the APEC leaders meeting, culminating, so to speak, with a summit meeting between him and a bilateral meeting between him and Xi Jinping. And I think that was the lead story, really, of the week, although there's a lot, for us trade people, a lot more to it than that there was an agreement reached. The president was quite proud in announcing it, a truce of sorts between the U.S. and China, where both would stand down a bit from recent measures, export controls, export bans on, or critical mineral ban by China, fentanyl tariffs on the U.S. side, standing down on port fees, that sort of thing. So things didn't spiral out of control. There seems to be a truce for the moment again. But so let's unpack this a little bit in terms of what we know. I haven't seen a lot of formal writing about it, but I'll start with you, Sara. You spent a lot of time in Beijing and were there, I think, stationed there most recently. So what do you make of what happened this week? And where do you think that leaves us and the trade relationship between the two sides going forward?
Thank you, and it's good to be here. Well, maybe just to put things into context a little bit, because we've been talking a lot about, everyone's been focused on the trip and this meeting, but just to back up a little bit, right before on October 9th, China announced expansive new export controls on rare earths. And it looked like for a time that this could really lead to a significant escalation in the relationship. The president threatened 100% tariffs, and some of the cabinet officials talked about other potential retaliatory measures that were going to be taken. And so going into sort of the week before this trip, no one really knew if this relationship was about to go off the cliff or whether or not they were going to reach some sort of as you put it, truce. So right before that, the Secretary Besson and Ambassador Greer met with their counterparts in Kuala Lumpur and were able to reach a framework. And so I think it's just important to remember that this basically what they've reached is a truce, but right before that, there was so much threat of disruption. It's really hard to sort of go back. We are going to be living in a world of continued disruption. And I think that even though this truce was reached, it's I think they talked about it being lasting for a year. I think there's good reason to believe that given all the tension and problems under the surface, that something could break through. For me personally, I think with China's announcement of those massive rare earth export controls, I think what we all need to be focused on is we're really in a new era. And that was such a pivotal moment. We're in a new era where China is much more aggressive, much more willing to use its choke points over the global economy. And that in itself is sort of like a historic moment. And I think the other thing that is historic coming out of this meeting, but probably not in a good way, is that the United States essentially appears to, and we're still, as you said, we're still waiting for official documents here, appears to have suspended some of our export controls in exchange for China's suspension of export controls. And so that is really historic in that, up until this point, it has not been the case that we've been willing to do so. So that is also really significant. I mean, in the past, it's been that export controls have been a red line. So I think from my perspective, the major takeaways here is fragile truce. Let's see if it holds. And we are in a new era where export controls and security concerns are going to be front and center.
And I'll open this question to everybody. Based on what you said about the United States reaction of lifting some of its own export controls, do you think that's a sign that China's getting the better of the U.S. on this, that it's playing its cards a little bit better? I mean, it's going back to what it had before, but we're, making new concessions in a way.
Well, absolutely. And maybe I can just underscore that point that Sara made, is that we're dealing with a new China here, and it's very different than the China that Ambassador Lighthizer negotiated with during Trump's first term. I mean, this is a very assertive China. Every measure the Trump administration has announced, China has not missed a beat and come in with a counter-retaliatory measure. And if you look at the scorecard of what we know so far or what was agreed to when the two met, kind of for every step the US took, every unwinding the US did, China did the same. And so China, we wanted more soybean purchases. We had to pay for them this time. We wanted, export control. We relaxed our affiliates rule for a year. And so it's a very different China. And I couldn't agree more with Sara. This is a fragile truce. The one point, though, that makes me a little optimistic that it may last for the year is the fact that Trump will be visiting China in April. And he'll probably be visiting China again next November for the APEC meeting that China will be hosting, and will be hosting the G20 meeting. So there are some incentives to try and keep this truce, intact. But I think there are going to be so many challenges and flashpoints during the year, and it's really going to be incumbent on both teams in Beijing and Washington to do everything they can to try and keep this temperature down for the year.
Sure. Let's go ahead. I see your.
Oh, yeah, no, I was just going to say, I mean, there are a number of actions that are already sort of in the queue and that I think we all know about. And then there's all the things on the US side. For example, we have a number of Section 232 investigations, right? There are any number of things that could, whether it's intentional or unintentional, upset this truce. And as you mentioned, having spent a long time in the embassy in Beijing, there are, at any given time, there's so many issues that are occurring in the relationship, whether it's something in the South China Sea or an American person or a balloon, there's something can really upend a truce that's very fragile. And I'll also just point out, and I think that this is obvious, but it's worth pointing out, it's not like anyone expected to really get to the fundamental issues in the relationship during this meeting. And this is very different than the first term, where the idea was to try to incentivize China to make certain structural changes to its economy. That's not really on the table. That's not really what we're discussing anymore.
And I would just add, because we didn't get to those issues, that also leads to, a greater probability that more tensions can arise in the coming weeks and months.
I wanted to ask about that a minute because when we talk, this is for the non-trade mavens who may be watching this. What we mean by truce is that there was a situation at the start of this year, or around April, when the president announced his reciprocal tariffs. And with some other countries, and we'll get to those, there have been trade agreements negotiated where U.S. has opened up markets and gotten concessions from them on a whole range of issues. In China, when we talk about truce, we talk about going back to where we were at the very beginning of this process, or somewhere near there. Moving beyond that into new trade issues, market opening, or other types of concessions by China. We haven't even started talking about that yet. And the question is, will we? I mean, we have another year, so the Chinese have played us to to a truce, to a standstill after 8 months of this year. And we're nowhere. And this was supposed to be the centerpiece of the administration's trade policy. This is really where the trade deficit and all the issues the administration talks about have their core. And it's spent the year sort of negotiating around the periphery of that, but it hasn't really gotten to the main event yet, if there is going to be one. Dawn, I want to give you an opportunity to give your thoughts on all of this as well.
Sure. Well, no, I completely agree with what Sara and Wendy have pointed out. And Joe, as you're articulating, there was some artfulness in how Xi has handed Trump a bit of a domestic win here. He can come back and say that he got all these things. He got the soybeans for the U.S. farmers. He's gotten, the restrictions on the critical minerals lifted. Yes, we're back at square one, but he doesn't have to sell it that way. And of course, Xi has been able to sell this as a win in China. Trump's able to sell it as a win here in the United States. And those who may not be into all the intricacies of trade are maybe none the wiser that we haven't really moved the goalposts forward here, at least in those issues. But like Wendy, I have a little bit of optimism on another front, is in the slew of documents coming out on the White House and USTR websites have been all these critical mineral arrangements, MOUs, where while, we are in a cat and mouse situation with China, and I think China will continue to use this as a threat going forward. It has really pushed the United States, and I think U.S. companies and companies in other market economies to put their money where their mouth is and really double down on rare earths exploration and refining, so that we can move away from China's chokehold on this issue. So I think that's a positive development coming out of this.
If I could just add, in some crazy way, I think China almost by making such a sweeping threat on critical mineral export restrictions, it has lit a fire under the administration, right, to conclude these critical mineral agreements, so far largely bilateral. But you even have Secretary Besson for the first time talking about working with allies and partners here. So I'm wondering, this might be almost, we may be seeing a pivot in the administration to realize that you can't just do this unilaterally or bilaterally. You need help from your friends. And so I think we're going to see a lot more activity on this front. And I think that's critical, that during this truce period, the United States needs to use this time to really try and reduce its dependency on China, so China doesn't have as much leverage as it has on the U.S. at this current point of time.
And I just want to underscore, if I may, just underscore. I absolutely agree. And one sort of detail that I hope doesn't get lost is that what China agreed to was a suspension of the measure, which is global in nature. So essentially, they've suspended it globally, not just for the United States.
Do we know that as a fact, though?
This is what I understand to be the case, and this is what they're talking about. But what's interesting is that in Geneva and then London after that was not the case. It was about getting basically rare earths for the United States. And I think Secretary Lutnick even said at one point, we tried for the whole world, but we couldn't get it. Something to that effect. I think this time the key was to get something that was global, to create that space for working with partners and allies on critical minerals.
Just a couple quick observations on this. First of all, obviously, I agree with all of you. The critical minerals agreements with Australia and other countries are a really important strategic move for the U.S. They will take time. to have effect, because you don't just put a shovel in the ground and critical minerals come out. And it's actually the process of critical minerals, processing of critical minerals that China really has a chokehold on, which is very polluting, and somebody's going to have to step up and do that. The other thing I just want to draw out this, make sure we're all on the same page. Those agreements are a little bit different than the reciprocal agreements, the implication of what you're saying, in that they are truly more voluntary. The reciprocal agreements are under some duress with these other countries because we're threatening tariffs on them. But it seems to me that there actually is a collective willingness to work with the U.S. and to work with each other to diversify the supply chain of rare earths and critical minerals. Is that fair enough?
Well, I think that it has to be a bit more voluntary, because we're talking about companies committing capital. I mean, it's great that the U.S. is committing XM to work and ensure that there is the financing necessary where they can be of assistance. But at the end of the day, um, you know, there has to be some ability of the private companies to make their own decisions in this space.
Right. Right, but it's one thing. But I think, as Wendy, you pointed out, I mean, this is the Chinese have kind of, by some of their actions, have kind of drawn attention. I don't think this is really necessarily deft diplomacy, from the fact that they've kind of drawn attention to the fact that there's a threat here that has brought the U.S. and its allies together, and the U.S. finally recognizing that there are times when working with your allies is a good idea. So.
Well, and I was happy to see, just as an aside, that U.S. paid their dues at the WTO.
I knew that would come up, Dawn.
Well, thank you, Dawn, for reminding us. Now, there's a story that hasn't hit the press too much, so thank you for reminding us. That's important to all of us who follow the global trading system. But speaking of allies, why don't we move a little bit on to Korea? Because obviously a close ally. There has been talk of, and there was talk, recently about concluding a trade agreement with Korea. Kind of got hung up on the, again, no real details, paper, and kind of got hung up on the definitions and operation of this investment fund, which the president came out of his meeting with Korea this week saying that they had reached a breakthrough on that, and it was a great agreement. And Wendy, I know you're following that closely. What do you make of that?
So look, there was an enormous amount of pressure on Korea to conclude a deal this week with the United States. Not number one, because they were increasingly becoming an outlier country without a deal, which meant that their companies, particularly their auto companies, were at a competitive disadvantage. But second, you had this big action forcing event, the Trump-Lee meeting. And if you couldn't reach a deal by that meeting, how could you keep up the momentum and conclude a deal after? And so, again, I think that Korea really moved to do everything it could to conclude a deal. And I think it helped that the United States at least showed some flexibility on the investment fund, particularly with respect, not asking for $350 billion up front, but allowing $20 billion per year to be allocated to this fund. I think that was a concession that helped Korea, put Korea in a position to agree to this fund. But again, we don't know the details yet. And it will be interesting to see how it differs from the MOU concluded between the US and Japan, which was very skewed towards the United States and pretty heavy-handed. But that wasn't the only part of this deal. I mean, for good news for Korea, it will now get a 15% tariff on automotive, which will allow it to compete on a level playing field with its Japan and European competitors. On semiconductors, it looked like it didn't do as well as Japan and Europe, in that it was given the same treatment as Taiwan. But let's note, Taiwan doesn't even have a deal with the United States yet. I wonder if it's nearly concluded, and the administration was just waiting for the Xi Jinping meeting to announce a Taiwan deal maybe in the next week or coming weeks. So anyway, Korea, like others, made a lot of FDI pledges. I don't think there's any agreement on what to do with visas, but that's going to be an extremely important component of any further FDI by Korean companies in the United States. But I would also note that this deal for Korea has to go through the National Assembly. And even though the same Progressive Party controls the Blue House and the National Assembly, deals like this get a lot of scrutiny in Korea. It's already getting some, some people are already expressing concerns about it. So it's going to be very interesting to watch how this makes it through the Korean National Assembly process. And I would just also say, unlike Japan, where folks are just so excited about all of this, I think in Korea, there's still kind of this underlying concern and anger about the FTA commitments just kind of being set aside, but also kind of the visa episode in Atlanta is still lingering. And, in many ways, it has introduced a somewhat chilling impact on the further FDI in the United States. I don't think it's insurmountable, but I also think that, we shouldn't kid ourselves and say everything is great now. I think Korea made the best out of a bad situation from its perspective. It has done the deal. And, I think it's hoping now that it can stabilize its relations with the United States and really focus on the issues of cooperation like AI and shipbuilding, semiconductors, critical minerals, where we have so much in common and really a lot we could jointly work on, as well as along with other partners in Asia.
Right. But so I'm going to get a little technical here because I would think it's hard to do. Very good point you're making. I mean, I think Korea definitely would want to move on to being more cooperative. But one impediment to that could be that if you receive a worse deal than Japan and Europe, then that's going to sort of sting in the longer run a little bit too. And on the tariff side, it wasn't clear to me. Maybe you're not clear to you either. I mean, 15% you said for autos, but I thought, is that the reciprocal rate now? And secondly, is it the rate? Is it the total rate? Is it going to be added, or is it going to be added on to MFN? Because Japan and Europe both have their 15% rates are do not stack on top of MFN rates. And it wasn't clear to me from anything I read, and maybe I missed something, that they got a similar deal.
Not clear, but I'm assuming that at least in terms of the reciprocal tariff, they did get the same treatment, as well as for the Section 232 automotive treatment. We know they got the same treatment. But with respect to semiconductors 232, again, Taiwan will be the reference point. But you're absolutely right. And here, let me just make a comment as as all of us as former USTR folks. When we did these deals, like, we got all the fact sheets and everything out right away so we could spin our side of the story. And here it's just, these deals are announced. We're reading stuff on, on social media about what they mean, but we haven't really seen the details yet. And so, we're going to have to see actually what was agreed to. And frankly, with respect to China and even Korea, I'm not sure if all of these details are really ironed out yet.
It was refreshing to actually see the Malaysia and Cambodia text so that we know what we're dealing with. But before we jump to that,
that's like red meat for a trade negotiator, right? To actually have something to read and see what's going on. I'm sorry, Sarah, you're going to say something too.
Oh, no, I 100% agree. I think a lot of it, and as many of you know, it really has to do with President Trump is himself the lead negotiator. So something is agreed at the meeting, and then everybody afterwards has to work to get it done. With the art agreements with Malaysia and Cambodia, those have been, in the works for a long time. And so it was teed up for him. But I think with everything else, we're going to continue to see that. And that's the same thing with China, too. We're still waiting for the fact sheet from the US side. Understand it should be coming soon, but.
And with Korea, just, we were talking about the autos 232. I mean, something that has been extremely important to Korea as well is the steel 232. And I haven't heard anything of any movement on that.
Absolutely. I think that that was a priority for Korea, but I think they recognized like a couple of months ago, not happening. So they're going to have to swallow those high tariffs on steel and aluminum, which are going to, very impactful in a negative way on Korean companies.
I mean, so far it's only the UK, as far as I can track, that has gotten any type of leeway on the steel 232s, and it's still to be proven how exactly they're going to be able to pull that off in terms of their own domestic industry.
And so I think that's why we've seen, I think we saw it with Japan. We'll move to Japan in a second, but just to say, both with Korea and Japan, there have been these, because of this sort of nature of these oral agreements or general agreements at the presidential level that have not been ratified or drafted out by the experts. You've seen these fits and starts where you think you have a deal, but then you don't have a deal because the details matter a lot, and there's a lot at stake here. So with Japan, it's on again, it's off again, it's on again, and Korea we could still be going through where we don't know. I mean, hopefully this is the end of it, but they seem to have reached an agreement in principle, as I guess we would call it, that still needs to be lawyered up, drafted by the trade negotiators of both sides, and that there's nothing that says that won't cause additional questions to arise, and the administration will withhold. What we've also seen is it will withhold its concessions on lowering its tariffs. You won't see an EO on that probably until they're satisfied that Korea has met all of the details that they want to have put in there.
I did see something that suggested that the tariff commitments from the U.S. would come into effect once Korea submitted its bill to the National Assembly. So not that it had to be passed, but just submitted. But just on your point, Joe, and maybe this is a good segue to the Southeast Asia piece of the trip. Is this the second framework agreement on trade concluded between the U.S. and Vietnam? When did they get to the real deal?
It's actually the first, and this is okay for someone who follows Vietnam closely. Let me just say, the original presidential Truth Social announcement of a deal with Vietnam came out in July. There was no joint statement at that time, and obviously no agreement either. So from between July and the end of October, what we have is a 2-page document, which is quite general in nature. It just lays out essentially the issue areas that are being discussed and saying that they're going to work them out. I do know that there are more, and this goes for Thailand as well, although Vietnam was an early starter. They really wanted to conclude an agreement. That there are rounds that are scheduled between now and the end of the year. So no. And it's like, this is kind of the tortoise and the hare sort of thing. Vietnam got off to a fast start and didn't finish. And then you have others like Malaysia who were somewhat more problematic. I wouldn't have, and then Cambodia, which has very little leverage, who concluded their agreements this week. And we did learn a lot. I'm interested to get, we don't have to spend the rest of this time pouring through the details, but let me just, I did look at them pretty closely this week. Let me just mention a few things and get everyone's thoughts on this. Okay, so there are market access commitments in both of them. There's no schedule though. We don't know exactly what they are, but clearly Malaysia was allowed to do a schedule that allowed them to reduce their tariffs on different schedules over a different number of years and not necessarily go to zero. Cambodia, which is interesting. So the U.S. had to have some flexibility on that. Cambodia, not really clear. I think it looks like you're going to have to schedule reductions as well. The U.S. put language in there that says it will retain I don't know if this is significant or not, it will retain its reciprocal tariff rate, and the other countries agreeing to it. So what does that mean if IEEPA authority is lost? Could you take action under 301 if the country violates the trade agreement? There were a whole series of other trade issues that for those of us who are familiar with trade texts know were just basically lifted out of the WTO. I find that interesting too. I mean, they were not really additional obligations on the country, things like import licensing and quantitative restrictions and state-owned enterprises and a whole bunch of those. And services even. I mean, the U.S. clearly, I think is another thing that's gone unnoticed. The U.S. clearly doesn't care about services trade, even though we have a big surplus. The Cambodians are giving national treatment on services. That's it. And the Malaysians are giving MFN treatment, except for ASEAN. ASEAN's allowed better treatment on services imports than the US is. There's a clear exception there. So in contrast to the way that they've been negotiating on manufacturing, really a big deal. And, I don't take services. I think none of us, I think all of us appreciate that services trade is also important. It just doesn't get noticed. The other thing is, so really important provision, obviously the US, and I'll stop here, there's other things as well. Things like export controls and sanctions against entities and people. Both countries agreed to bring their trade actions, trade measures, and other measures into alignment with the US. Both have provisions saying basically that in the context of preserving their own sovereignty, whatever that means, that was obviously of big importance to the US. I wonder, again, there's nothing specific that's listed there, and it does say alignment, which is a kind of a relatively vague term. I think we know what it means, but it seems to me that those are going to have to be sort of worked out case by case. I mean, because it doesn't actually say what the country's supposed to do, and whether it's done to the U.S. satisfaction. So, but that wasn't, a piece of this that was distinct, from previous, unlike a lot of the other provisions, which I said just sort of repeated WTO provisions. So, what do you make of all that? Or do you agree with me? I mean, I just, that was my sense,
No, I think that's a really great summary, Joe. A couple highlights on the services side. I'm still encouraged that this administration appears to be fighting for the e-commerce moratorium.
Oh, that's true. There's a big digital section. I forgot to mention that. Yeah.
So I do think that is a positive. It is a reference, to the WTO, and it is something that the Biden administration did not appear willing to really fight for, and that they're actually putting this in the agreements and willing to go after that. I think that is a good thing on the services side of the ledger. For us trade nerds, last week was World Standards Week, and ANSI had some meetings last week and some follow-up meetings this week. So hanging out with my standards and conformity assessment buddies, there was a fair amount of appreciation for the TBT related text that is in the agreement. That it cites the WTO, which is an ongoing issue that we have with the EU on TBT issues, that they don't necessarily follow all the WTO rules on TBT, to get these countries to say that they're going to do so, and to go beyond that into not extreme, but some level of specificity on conformity assessment procedures, which, for those who don't know, that's the testing of products. And this is one of the biggest trade concerns that our exporters in the United States have when entering other markets is, okay, you've tested it at a US lab, and all of these other countries then want you to pay, thousands, tens of thousands of dollars to have to test it in their market. Under the TBT agreement, you're not supposed to have to do that. This agreement is laying out that you do not have to do that, and being specific about it. This is very exciting to those of us in the standards and conformity assessment world. So there's some specificity there in some of these areas that's very encouraging. One other aspect, though, on the security, the part 5 of these agreements, it deals with the economic and national security provisions that basically say if the US imposes tariffs on another country for national security provisions, you, Malaysia, you, Cambodia, you are also supposed to do this. And yes, it is unclear how they're going to do this, but this did worry me a bit from an MFN perspective that, to this point, you've seen the United States going further away from MFN in fits and starts, but not completely. It's still, MFN does still exist in the US schedule, but to kind of be pushing other countries to do this. I want to hope that it's truly national security, and that does count as an exemption. But the further erosion of MFN and putting it so starkly in these agreements was of concern.
Well, the president imposed a tariff, threatened to impose a tariff last week on Canada for a television commercial under the national security provisions of the law. So they're taking quite a broad view of that. But I hope you're right, Dawn.
If I can offer a different perspective on that, I think that, especially looking at it from the China perspective, the United States has tried with many of our allies and partners to do something collectively on China for years. Lots of challenges there. What was interesting to me about these provisions is it signals that the United States is going to be much more forceful in trying to get partners to work with us on areas where we have common concerns with China. Look, they don't have to do it, but the agreement, the way that it's structured, looks like they at least have to consult on it. And if they don't, potentially there's a threat that, reciprocal tariffs could go up. So it creates some real incentive to work with the United States on this. And I think from the U.S. perspective, especially if you talk to folks in the Trump administration, I think they see this as a really big positive that's going to be necessary to deal with China in the coming years.
So, when I read the Malaysia agreement, my initial reactions were like, kudos to the U.S. team that negotiated this deal, and I think it was largely our AUSTR colleagues, because wow, was it detailed and just an updated agreement from the traditional FTAs we negotiated, and particularly with respect to market access. Okay. For those of us who've been in the trenches trying to get these countries to reduce their tariffs and deal with these long-standing non-tariff measures that year after year were in our NTE report, it looks like the administration really scored a home run here, and without giving a lot in return, was able to get countries like Malaysia, Cambodia, and I expect other Southeast Asian countries to unilaterally disarm on tariffs and to get rid of these long-standing non-tariff measures. And I think we all need to applaud the administration for that. On the flip side, I guess I read this agreement and was kind of surprised that a country like Malaysia could agree to all of these provisions. And here I'm going to move from not just market access, but these economic security provisions and the provisions that have to deal with the behavior of companies from companies from third countries within their borders. Okay, the word China does not appear in this text, but let's be honest, when you really read the fine print here, this is really trying to, kind of lock Malaysia in on actions we would expect it to take against Chinese companies, if indeed they were not just circumventing the deal, but pursuing unfair trade practices or being subject to measures by the United States. So I think that is, just a remarkable development. And frankly, and I'd be interested in Sara's reaction here, a bit surprised that China hasn't come back publicly to warn Malaysia and other countries here, because we just saw a few weeks ago when Mexico threatened to raise its auto tariff, China did not miss a beat and basically threatened Mexico, be careful in terms of what you do here. The other just general comment I want to make is there are no dispute settlement procedures in this agreement. So it's basically, the U.S. will unilaterally decide whether Malaysia or whatever country is living up to its obligations. And that's, from my perspective, kind of lends itself to why the deal has just like a paragraph on intellectual property protection. In our former FTAs, we used to have 75 pages here, but very general language. But I think because the U.S. can enforce it the way it wants, the details in some of these traditional areas just seemed less important, including on services, as Joe mentioned. So I think over these deals, these countries, I have to expect that, or have to conclude that many of these countries, particularly in Southeast Asia, they just feel they have no choice but to, agree to these deals, hope at least for in the short term, this will give them some stability and get the tariffs down. But we'll have to see how this all unfolds in the next 3.5 years, because I don't think this is the end of the story, particularly if Section 232 tariffs come down the road. The other interesting thing, and I'd ask my colleagues about this, is it's a bit surprised that at least there was nothing in the agreement about Malaysia getting special treatment with respect to potential tariffs in the semiconductor area where they are, very active. And I just wonder, maybe there were some private assurances here, but
I
that
heard
was
the
a notable
opposite.
omission.
Yeah, no, I heard the opposite, that Trump told Anwar, you're just going to have to wait for that shoe to drop. Words to that effect. But I don't know. Sarah, I'll turn to you in a second, but I just want to ask one question, because something you said, Wendy, worries me a little bit. You lauded the USTR negotiators, which I agree with, but because of what's on the face of it in these agreements, especially in terms of market access. But it concerns me that basically this just confirms, I think, the sort of Greer philosophy, Lighthizer philosophy, that, as I've said in the past, you've got to put a gun to these people's head to get them to, and this is the way the world works now. Like, working things out in multilateral and plurilateral negotiations is too slow. It doesn't work. It allows countries to gang up on the United States, and this does work, and it's evident. And it just worries me a bit that that's the message that maybe they're going to be able to send now to the rest of the world, that this is, the proof is in the pudding. We were able to get results where other people were not able to. And what do you think about that? Is that unfair?
I think that is fair. And, what worries me is, okay, like, this works for now, but these countries are pivoting very quickly to reduce their dependence on the United States and work with others. And so, like, for example, there was a meeting of the RCEP countries in KL, didn't get a lot of press here, but they're talking about expanding the membership and updating the agreement. And I think many of these countries, the message for them is, yeah, we'll do these deals with the United States, but the lesson we're going to take away from this is we need now to maximize our efforts in terms of reducing dependency on the United States and working more with other countries, and diversifying not only our diversifying markets, but also diversifying sources of inputs.
If I could just note, at the very end of the first Trump administration, there was a great deal of discussion about the request offer process at the World Trade Organization and educating the administration on how that worked. And there was a fair amount of frustration over what they did see as inefficiencies in that process. And I think that was a contributing factor to what went into the April 2nd strategy, was that they knew what it would take to do this the way the rules lay out it needs to go, and the rules just didn't fit with what they wanted to do. And I completely agree with Wendy that other countries now are going to be turning towards agreements that don't have the United States. And just this week, I mean, China did announce that they have refreshed their agreement with ASEAN. So I don't know the details of what's in that, or if there are things that might balance some of what's in the Malaysia and Cambodia agreements.
So, Sarah, what's China's diplomatic response to this been? Has it been quiet in the background? I mean, there was a sort of a tour that Xi Jinping made of Southeast Asia earlier this year, to kind of do trade diplomacy in a way and offer some things, and as an alternative to the U.S. tariffs. We've heard maybe less about that more recently, but what do you think their response has been? This puts the Southeast Asian countries in particular in kind of an excruciating position between the two powers.
Yeah, I mean, I think you're right that earlier this year, particularly after Liberation Day, I think China saw a huge opening here, thinking, well, who's going to want to align with the United States now? So it created a lot of opportunity, I think, for China in a number of other countries, including Southeast Asia. I think what was so notable about this trip was that it sent sort of the opposite signal, right? Because all these deals were reached, including with a lot of these provisions, the president, was all over Asia, and everyone seemed happy to see him. I think they very much came away with the feeling of we are here. We've laid down, a marker, especially in terms of how we see the relationship going and how these relationships going. And I think I think that the president went into the meeting with President Xi feeling momentum, frankly, from all of these deals in Asia. So kind of the opposite. Now, to Wendy's point, of course, we'll have to see what happens. And I believe there's no doubt in my mind that China will let its concerns be known. And so, the countries are going to be in a very difficult position. But I think that was already the case, right? It was already the case that China puts a lot of pressure on countries in the region. And so what the United States is doing something similar. And so now there's going to be a lot more, it's going to be a lot harder for them to decide what to do.
Okay, remains to be seen. I think we should close it there. Sara, as the most recent joiner of this eminent podcast, will give you the last word. And let me just close it by saying thank you all for your input today. I'm Joe DeMond. Thank you for joining us, and see you next week at WITA's Friday Exchange.
Thank you for watching and listening to WITA's Friday Exchange. WITA is the International Trade Membership Association. If you haven't already, be sure to subscribe on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, or YouTube. New episodes drop every Friday, and you'll be the first to know. Thank you for joining us, and we'll be back next week with WITA's Friday Exchange.